Imagine sitting at the head of the table. You have built an empire, secured your legacy, and tonight is the night you celebrate your future. You reach for a piece of the engagement cake, the ultimate symbol of your new life. But just before the silver fork touches your lips, a maid's daughter shatters the plate across the room and screams, "It smells strange. Don't eat it." In that split second, what do? Do you let blind anger take over? Or do you pause to uncover the lethal betrayal hidden in the frosting? Welcome to the vault of true leadership. Some men are simply born to rule, and there are profound lessons the school of life will never teach you, lessons only the bosses know. This channel does not glorify crime. We decode the mindset, the unyielding resilience, and the guarded secrets behind absolute power. Today's story will teach you that your sharpest weapon is never violence, but a calm, observing mind. It reveals how true strength lies in knowing when to hold your fire, valuing human life, and outsmarting your enemies with flawless strategy. If you are ready to elevate your mindset and master the art of control, hit that like button, share this story with a trusted ally, and subscribe to join our inner circle. Drop a comment below. How would you have reacted?
The grand dining room of the Reyes estate was a testament to a life built on power, persistence, and quiet authority. Heavy mahogany paneling lined the walls, absorbing the low, polite murmurs of the elite guests who had gathered to celebrate the engagement of Dominic Reyes. At 44, Dominic carried himself with the heavy, unhurried grace of a man who had survived the turbulent waters of the underworld and emerged on the other side as a legitimate leader in modern logistics and enterprise. He looked at the table, watching the crystal glasses catch the light of the massive chandelier above. To his right sat Elena, his fiancée, whose family had long been a pillar of the old money establishment in Boston. She looked radiant in her emerald gown, her smile bright, though there was a certain fleeting tension in the muscles around her eyes that Dominic, with his decades of reading people, could not quite place. Dominic's phone remained silent in his pocket. Earlier that day, he had reviewed the quarterly reports for the shipping yards. He had spent years transforming his family's legacy from one of fear and violence to one of industry and community stability. He was a man who believed in structure. He believed that to lead men, one had to govern oneself first. "To the future," Elena whispered, lifting her champagne flute, her voice as smooth as the silk she wore. "To us, Dominic." "To us," Dominic replied, his deep voice carrying across the table. He took a sip, the cold, crisp taste of the wine clearing his palate. The service staff moved like ghosts in the background, clearing the main course and preparing the dessert. The head maid, Mrs. Voss, oversaw the service with the quiet dignity she had maintained for over 2 decades. Her daughter, Camilla Voss, stood near the service entrance. Camilla, at 31, was an accomplished surgeon at one of the city's top hospitals. She had chosen a path far removed from the estate's shadow, dedicating her life to saving others. Yet tonight, she was here to support her mother during the family's most important evening. Camilla's eyes scanned the room. She was used to observing life and death in the sterile, high-pressure atmosphere of the operating room, where a single miscalculation could mean the end. Her medical training had given her a unique perspective on the fragility of human existence. She knew that people often ignored the subtle signs of danger, focusing instead on what they wanted to see. The head waiter brought out the centerpiece of the evening, a magnificent 3-tier cake covered in white frosting and delicate sugar flowers, prepared by the estate's private chef under Elena's direct supervision. It was a masterpiece, a symbol of the union between two powerful families. Dominic watched the cake being placed before him. The scent of vanilla and sweet cream filled the air, rich and heavy. The chef placed a single slice onto a fine porcelain plate and set it before the head of the Reyes family. Dominic picked up his silver fork, the weight of the silver familiar and grounding in his hand. He took a deep breath, preparing to take the first bite as the guests raised their glasses to toast the happy couple. But Camilla, standing by the doorway, felt a sudden tightening in her chest. Her medical instincts, honed by years of analyzing chemical imbalances and toxic compounds, kicked in. She had passed by the service preparation area minutes earlier and had caught a faint, bitter scent that did not belong in a bakery. It was an odor she had encountered in toxicology lectures, a smell designed to be masked by heavy sugar and vanilla. As Dominic's hand moved closer to his mouth with the first bite, Camilla's mind raced through the consequences of silence. "Mr. Reyes, please do not eat it." The scream cut through the polite chatter of the dining room with the sharpness of a scalpel. Camilla did not think twice. Before the security guards could react, she stepped forward, her heels clicking rapidly against the hardwood floor. Dominic froze, his fork hovering inches from his lips. He turned his dark, intense gaze toward the young woman who had just shattered the evening's decorum. The guests fell silent, some gasping, others looking at the maid's daughter with undisguised shock and outrage. "Camilla, what is the meaning of this?" Elena's voice was sharp, a brittle edge showing through her polished exterior. "Have you lost your mind, interrupting such a moment?" Camilla ignored the hostess. She moved directly to the table, her eyes fixed on the porcelain plate in front of Dominic. Without hesitation, she reached out and knocked the silver fork from his hand, sending the slice of cake sliding onto the tablecloth. A collective breath was drawn in by the room. Dominic's security detail tensed, their hands dropping toward their jackets, waiting for the Reyes boss to give the signal to remove the woman. But Dominic raised a single hand, holding them back. He looked at Camilla, his expression unreadable, his eyes reflecting the quiet calculation of a man who had seen many threats in his life. Camilla did not flinch. She stood tall, her posture firm, looking directly into the eyes of the man who commanded the city's largest business empire. "Mr. Reyes, please do not eat it," she repeated, her voice steady now, carrying a weight of conviction that commanded the room's attention. "It smells strange. There is a sharp chemical odor in the frosting." In any situation, taking a moment to observe the details saves not just lives, but the very core of our integrity. We must always look closer before we act. Dominic looked from the ruined cake to the determined young woman before him. He could smell the faint, unusual scent rising from the spilled frosting. It was not the sweet scent of sugar. It was something synthetic, something cold. He leaned back in his chair, folding his hands together on the edge of the mahogany table. The tension in the room was palpable, thick enough to cut with a knife. Dominic's closest advisor, Vance, shifted in his seat, his hand resting on his tablet, ready to initiate the estate's security protocol. "You have interrupted my engagement dinner, Dr. Voss," Dominic said, his voice quiet but echoing in the large room. "You have destroyed a gift from my fiancée. You understand the weight of such an action in this house?" "I do, sir," Camilla replied, her voice remaining perfectly even. "But a life, any life, whether it belongs to the head of a family or an ordinary person, is the highest value we have. If we fail to speak the truth when it matters most, our power and our wealth mean nothing." Dominic looked at Elena, whose face had gone pale, her fingers gripping the edge of the table until her knuckles turned white. He observed the subtle shift in her posture, the sudden lack of eye contact. He had known Elena for 5 years, but in this singular moment, the divide between their worlds became clear. Camilla, the daughter of a maid who worked in the estate, valued the truth more than the comfort of the wealthy guests. "Vance," Dominic said, not taking his eyes off the young doctor. "Take the plate. Have the lab analyze the contents within the hour. No one leaves this room until we know exactly what is in this frosting." "Yes, Mr. Reyes," Vance responded, stepping forward with a pair of sterile gloves and an evidence bag, scooping up a portion of the cake while avoiding the eyes of the guests. Dominic stood up, his presence dominating the room. He did not shout. He did not show the anger that many expected from a man of his background. Instead, he looked at Camilla with a nod of deep respect. We do not resolve crises with blind anger, Dominic said, addressing the room, his words clear and measured. Wisdom is knowing how to measure the cost of your actions before taking a step. A calm mind builds a secure future for everyone around us. The guests whispered among themselves, the celebratory mood completely replaced by the heavy reality of a betrayal in their midst. Dominic turned to Camilla, his gaze softening just enough to show his appreciation. Dr. Voss, Dominic said, his tone respectful. You have shown courage and clarity tonight. My door is open to you. Let us see what the night reveals. The study of the Reyes estate was a sanctuary of dark mahogany and leather-bound volumes. It was here that Dominic Reyes conducted the business that kept a sprawling logistics network running across the eastern seaboard. In the corners of the room, shadows danced in the low amber light of the desk lamps, but Dominic's face remained illuminated and perfectly calm. He sat behind the massive executive desk, his fingers steepled under his chin. Across the room, Elena paced, the heavy rustle of her emerald gown breaking the silence. Her face was a mask of nervous energy, her breathing shallow. You cannot possibly believe that I had anything to do with this, Dominic, she said, her voice rising slightly, betraying the polished exterior she usually maintained. This is an insult to my family name. We have worked alongside the Reyes family for years. We share the same social circles, the same standing in Boston. Dominic did not respond immediately. He let the silence stretch, a tactic he had learned long ago in the negotiation rooms of the city. He observed her hands. They were trembling slightly. A person who is innocent of a crime they are accused of usually reacts with righteous anger. A person who fears discovery reacts with defensive posturing. Elena, Dominic began, his voice a low, steady rumble that commanded immediate attention. I have not accused you. I am simply gathering the facts. In our world, a misstep can cost you everything. A man in my position does not survive by jumping to conclusions, nor does he survive by ignoring the obvious signs of a threat. Before Elena could formulate a reply, the heavy oak door swung open. Vance entered the study, holding a secure, padded briefcase. His expression was grim. Behind him, Mrs. Voss, the head maid and Camilla's mother, stood with her hands folded in front of her apron. She looked pale, her eyes cast down in respect, but there was a quiet strength in her demeanor. The preliminary analysis is complete, Mr. Reyes, Vance said, setting the briefcase on the desk. He clicked the locks open and pulled out a digital tablet displaying the lab's findings. The frosting contained a concentrated dose of a synthetic paralytic agent. It is a compound typically used in advanced medical research, not something you can purchase on the street. It acts quickly, shutting down the respiratory system within minutes. Dominic nodded slowly, his eyes narrowing as he processed the information. He looked from the tablet up to Elena, whose face had gone entirely white. She sank into one of the leather armchairs, her hands covering her face. It seems, Dominic said softly, that someone wanted me out of the picture before this marriage could be finalized. And they chose the engagement dinner to do it. The cake was prepared under your direct supervision, Elena. Who had access to the kitchen during the final preparation? Only the staff, Elena whispered through her fingers. Only the staff and the kitchen assistants. I didn't see anything unusual. I swear to you, Dominic. Dominic turned his gaze toward Mrs. Voss. Mrs. Voss, you have been with this family for over 20 years. You know the staff better than anyone. Have you seen anyone acting suspiciously in the last 48 hours? Mrs. Voss stepped forward, her back straight, and her voice clear despite the tension in the room. Mr. Reyes, the staff is loyal to this house. We understand the responsibility we bear. But yesterday afternoon, a delivery man arrived with a special order of vanilla extract, claiming it was a gift from the supplier. He left it with the assistant chef. I did not think to question it, as we often receive such deliveries. Dominic made a mental note of the delivery. He looked at Mrs. Voss with a deep sense of respect for her integrity and her long service to the estate. Thank you, Mrs. Voss. You may return to the staff quarters. We will handle the rest of the investigation, Dominic said. As Mrs. Voss bowed and left the room, Dominic stood up from his desk. He walked over to the large bay window, looking out over the illuminated gardens of the estate. The rain had begun to fall, tapping against the glass like a warning. He turned back to Elena and Vance, his presence filling the room with an undeniable authority. "We do not resolve crises with blind anger," Dominic said, his words measured and precise. "Wisdom is knowing how to measure the cost of your actions before taking a step. A calm mind builds a secure future for everyone around us. If we act out of vengeance, we fall into the trap our enemies have set for us." "But Dominic, they are trying to destroy us," Elena protested, looking up with desperation in her eyes. "We need to strike back. We need to show them the Reyes family is not to be trifled with." "Striking back without knowing who holds the other end of the string is the definition of a fool's errand," Dominic replied calmly, walking back to his desk. "We will not act like the syndicates of the past. We operate through logic, evidence, and superior strategy. Vance, I want you to trace the delivery vehicle. Check the security cameras at the gates. We will find out who sent the compound, and we will deal with them through the proper, legitimate channels." Elena watched him, a look of confusion and reluctant admiration in her eyes. She realized that the man she thought she knew, the powerful boss of the Reyes Empire, had evolved into something far more dangerous and sophisticated than a simple street kingpin. He was a man who valued truth and stability above all else. "And what about the girl?" Elena asked, her tone shifting to one of resentment. "That Maid's daughter. She ruined the entire evening. She made a scene in front of our guests." Dominic's expression hardened, his dark eyes meeting Elena's with an unyielding intensity. "Dr. Voss acted with courage," Dominic stated firmly. "She observed something that you, despite being in charge of the preparation, failed to notice. She chose to protect a life rather than maintain the social decorum of the evening. We owe her our gratitude, not our contempt. In this house, we respect those who value human life above appearances." The study fell silent once more. Dominic dismissed Elena with a brief nod, instructing Vance to escort her to the east wing of the estate, where she would remain until the investigation was concluded. Left alone in the quiet of his study, Dominic looked at the silver fork resting on his desk. He picked it up, feeling its weight, and let out a long, slow breath. The game had changed, and he needed to look closer at the world around him. The sterile, bright lights of the city hospital's research laboratory were a stark contrast to the dark, heavy mahogany of the Reyes estate. The hum of the ventilation system created a constant low white noise that allowed for deep, uninterrupted concentration. Here, life and death were measured not in power or wealth, but in milligrams, cellular structures, and the steady beat of a heart monitor. Dr. Camilla Voss stood at the stainless steel workbench, her hands steady as she adjusted the microscope. She had spent the last 2 hours analyzing the samples she had taken from the engagement party. The vial of clear liquid she had extracted from the cake's frosting sat in the center of the tray, glowing faintly under the UV light. Her life as a surgeon was worlds apart from the syndicate wars that defined the city's darker history. She had chosen medicine because she believed that human life was the most valuable asset in the world. Yet the two worlds had collided tonight. She could not ignore the fact that the man sitting at the head of the table, Dominic Reyes, was a figure of immense influence, someone who could either bring destruction or bring security to the city. The heavy glass door of the laboratory slid open, and the sound of measured footsteps echoed on the linoleum floor. Camilla did not need to look up to know who had arrived. The presence of Dominic Reyes was as heavy and undeniable in the sterile room as it was in the grand dining hall. "The preliminary tests are finished, Mr. Reyes," Camilla said without turning, her eyes still focused on the monitor connected to the gas chromatograph. "The compound is a highly purified form of a synthetic neurotoxin. It is not something you find in a common pharmacy. It acts by blocking the nervous signals to the diaphragm, causing respiratory failure within 7 to 10 minutes. Dominic stepped closer to the bench, his dark eyes observing the equipment and the precision with which Camilla worked. He was accustomed to dealing with people who were either afraid of him or trying to use him. But here stood a woman who was driven entirely by a sense of duty and a commitment to preserving life. "You saved my life, Dr. Voss," Dominic said, his deep voice carrying a tone of genuine respect that cut through the sterile atmosphere of the lab. "And you did so at the risk of your own standing in that room. Many people would have kept quiet, afraid of the consequences." Camilla turned to face him. She removed her surgical mask, revealing a face that was composed, showing no signs of intimidation. "Medicine is intended to heal and preserve life, Mr. Reyes," Camilla said, meeting his gaze directly. "When it is misused to harm, it breaks the fundamental trust of human dignity. We must always protect the vulnerable, regardless of the social hierarchy or the danger involved. If we fail to speak up against injustice, we become complicit in the act itself." Dominic looked at her, noting the intelligence and the clear sense of morality that guided her decisions. He recognized in her the same kind of resilience that he had built in himself over the years. It was a different kind of strength, one rooted in knowledge and compassion rather than force. But it was equally powerful. "You speak of human dignity," Dominic said, leaning slightly against the edge of the workbench. "In my world, dignity is something people fight for, and sometimes die for. But you remind me that true strength lies in service to others. That is a lesson I have been trying to teach my team as we transition our operations to legitimate enterprises." Camilla looked surprised for a moment, then a small, respectful smile appeared on her lips. "It is never too late to change the course of a life, Mr. Reyes," she replied, turning back to the computer screen to print out the final report. "The compound we found can be traced. I have compared the chemical signature with the hospital's database of pharmaceutical manufacturing waste. This specific variant is produced only by a few experimental laboratories overseas." Dominic took the report from her hand. He scanned the data, his mind working through the implications. Vance had already begun checking the shipping manifests, and this new piece of data would allow them to narrow down the suspects significantly. "You have a keen mind, Doctor," Dominic said, folding the report and placing it inside his inner jacket pocket. "Your mother has served my family with loyalty for many years, and now you have saved my life. You have earned a place of trust in this house. If you ever need anything, protection, resources, or support for your research, you have only to ask." "I do not want rewards, Mr. Reyes," Camilla said, her voice gentle but firm. "I only want to ensure that the hospital and the people in our community remain safe from this kind of violence." "Safety is something we build together," Dominic said, turning toward the door. "When we stand by each other and value the truth, no adversity can break our resolve. I will ensure that the laboratory and your family are fully protected while we uncover the source of this plot." Dominic walked out of the laboratory, leaving Camilla standing in the bright, quiet room. She watched him go, realizing that the man she had just saved was not the monster the rumors made him out to be. He was a man who listened, a man who could be reasoned with, and a man who understood the value of a noble purpose. Dominic stepped out into the cool night air of the city, the rain having stopped, leaving the streets slick and reflective under the streetlights. He climbed into the back of his waiting town car, where Vance was already seated with the secure tablet. "We have a lead, sir," Vance said, handing the tablet to Dominic. "The shipping manifest shows a container registered to a logistics company linked to the Salazar family. It arrived at the port 3 days ago." Dominic looked at the data, his jaw tightening. The Salazar family was a rival faction that had been trying to disrupt his transition into legitimate business operations. He closed his eyes for a moment, remembering the words Camilla had spoken in the lab. He would not respond with the violence of the old days. He would use the full weight of the law, the financial networks he had built, and the truth to neutralize the threat. "We do not need to shout to be heard, Vance," Dominic said, looking out the window at the passing city lights. "The sharpest mind is sharper than any weapon. Prepare the legal and financial documents. We will dismantle their supply chain from the inside out." He thought of the cake, the smooth frosting, and the underlying poison. The world was full of hidden dangers, but as long as there were people like Camila who were willing to look closer and speak the truth, There was hope for a secure future. He reached into his pocket and touched the report, ready to face whatever lay ahead with a clear mind and a steady hand. The rain had settled into a steady, cold drizzle by the time Dominic's town car pulled up to the edge of District 4. The docks here were a relic of an older, grittier Boston, a place where fortunes were made and lost in the shadows of towering cranes and rusting shipping containers. While Dominic had transitioned his empire into modern logistics, the old port still held the secrets of the city's underbelly. Dominic adjusted the collar of his tailored overcoat, stepping out onto the wet asphalt. Vance followed closely behind, an umbrella shielding the digital tablet that held the latest shipping manifests and tracking data. Waiting under the overhang of a derelict warehouse was Silas, a man who had spent 40 years on the waterfront, seeing everything and saying only what he was paid to say. "Evening, Mr. Reyes," Silas rasped, pulling his wool cap down against the damp chill. "You're out late for a man who's supposed to be celebrating." "Celebrations can wait when the foundation is threatened, Silas," Dominic said, his voice level, cutting through the sound of the falling rain. "We need to trace the shipment that contained the compound analyzed at the lab, a synthetic neurotoxin disguised as an additive for the estate's celebration." Silas let out a low, dry whistle, his eyes darting toward the dark waters of the harbor. "That's a bold move, even for the people we don't talk about. But I might have what you need." 3 days ago, a crate came in on a freighter from the European terminal. It wasn't registered to your logistics firm, and it wasn't registered to the city's medical supply chain. It was flagged as industrial cleaning solvents. "And who signed for the solvent?" Vance asked, tapping the screen of his tablet. "That's the interesting part," Silas said, stepping out from the overhang and pointing a calloused finger toward a distant, dimly lit pier. "It was signed by a shell company linked to the Salazar interests. They've been trying to muscle their way into your shipping routes for the past 6 months. They think that by disrupting your wedding to Elena's family, they can create enough chaos to take over the port." Dominic looked out toward the dark sea, his expression remaining perfectly still. He did not let the rising anger at the mention of the Salazar name show on his face. In his world, anger was a vulnerability. It clouded judgment and led to irreversible mistakes. "They think they can play a game of shadows," Dominic said, his words measured. "But shadows only exist when there is no light to expose them. We do not need to shout to be heard, Vance. The sharpest mind is sharper than any weapon. We will use the law and the financial records to expose their operation." Silas looked at Dominic with a mixture of respect and surprise. The old rumors claimed the Reyes family would have responded with fire and lead, but the man standing before him was thinking several steps ahead, treating the docks not as a battlefield, but as a chessboard. "What do you want me to do with this information, Mr. Reyes?" Silas asked, leaning in closer. "Keep your eyes on the next freighter from that terminal," Dominic replied. "Do not interfere, but let me know the moment another crate hits the dock. We are going to let them hang themselves with their own operations." Dominic turned back to the town car, the cool, damp air filling his lungs. As the vehicle pulled away from the docks and headed back toward the estate, he looked out at the lights of the city. The threat was not just a simple attack on his person, it was an attempt to destabilize the social and economic fabric of the city. He thought of Camilla's words at the laboratory, that preserving life and truth was the highest value. "Vance," Dominic said, his voice calm and deliberate. "Contact our legal team. I want a full audit of the Salazar holdings in the Boston area. Let's find out where their capital is coming from and who is backing their logistics operations." "Yes, Mr. Reyes," Vance responded, typing rapidly on his device. "But what about Elena's family? The records show that the shell company used the same financial institution as the firm her father uses for their investments." Dominic's eyes narrowed slightly in the dim light of the cabin. It was a detail he had not missed, and one that required further examination. The web of deceit was becoming clearer, and he needed to make sure that the truth was exposed without causing unnecessary destruction to those who were innocent. "We do not accuse without absolute certainty," Dominic said, leaning his head back against the leather seat. "We must find the connection, but we must also ensure that we do not break the trust of those who depend on us. Let us keep this information between us for now." Back at the estate, the quiet of the night was broken only by the sound of the security teams making their rounds. The east wing of the house, where Elena had been instructed to stay, remained dark and silent. Across the courtyard, the staff quarters were still humming with a quiet, persistent energy. Camilla Voss had returned to the estate after her shift at the hospital. She could not sleep. The weight of the evening's events hung heavily in her mind, and she felt a deep need to understand the source of the danger that had nearly cost Dominic his life. She made her way to her mother's sitting room, a cozy space filled with old photographs and books that had been collected over 2 decades of service to the Reyes family. Her mother, Mrs. Voss, was asleep in the adjacent room, exhausted by the night's turmoil. Camilla sat at the small wooden desk, her fingers tracing the edges of a worn leather-bound photo album. As she opened the drawer to find a pen, her hand caught on the back panel. The wood felt loose. She pulled the drawer out entirely and found a thick manila envelope tucked into the space behind it. It was sealed with red wax, bearing the emblem of the Reyes family's old administrative office. Camilla hesitated for a moment, her surgical training reminding her that curiosity without caution could be dangerous. But the need to protect the truth and the people she cared about outweighed her hesitation. She carefully broke the wax seal and pulled out the contents. Inside was a ledger detailing financial transfers and shipping contracts from the past 5 years. But what caught her attention was a separate document, a confidential memo from the logistics division of the Reyes shipping firm, signed by Roger Vance, the head of logistics operations. The memo outlined a series of unauthorized shipments of experimental chemicals routed through the warehouse that Dominic had recently acquired. It listed payments made to the Salazar family's shell companies. It was clear that someone within Dominic's own enterprise was working with the rivals to destabilize the business and poison the Reyes name. Camilla stared at the names on the page. Roger Vance. He was not just an employee, he was the younger brother of Vance, Dominic's closest advisor. The realization struck her like a cold wave. The threat was not coming from the outside alone, it was an insider job, a betrayal of the deepest kind. She knew the implications of such a discovery. If she brought this to Dominic, it would mean breaking the trust between the Reyes family and their most loyal advisors. But if she did not, the entire enterprise could be destroyed from within. Transparency and honesty are the pillars of a strong relationship, Camilla whispered to herself, the words she had spoken in the lab echoing in the quiet room. She carefully placed the file back into the envelope and hid it in her bag. She needed to speak with Dominic immediately. She could not let another day pass without exposing the truth. Leaving the staff quarters, Camilla walked across the courtyard toward the main study. The night was dark, but the lights in Dominic's office were still on, a sign that the head of the house was awake and working. She knocked on the heavy oak door. "Enter," Dominic's voice called out from within. Camilla turned the knob and stepped into the room. Dominic was standing by the desk, a map of the city's shipping ports spread out before him. He looked up, his dark, intense gaze softening slightly when he saw who it was. "Dr. Voss," Dominic said, stepping forward. "Is there something wrong? You should be resting after the long night." "Mr. Reyes, I found something," Camilla said, her voice steady, though her heart was pounding. She stepped to the desk and placed the manila envelope onto the dark wood. "I was in the staff quarters, and I found this hidden behind the desk in my mother's room. I believe it belongs to one of your administrative staff." Dominic looked at the envelope, his expression changing. The quiet calm that usually defined him gave way to a sharp, focused intensity. He broke the seal and spread the documents out across the desk. He scanned the pages, his jaw tightening as his eyes caught the signature on the memo. The silence in the study was deafening. The ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner seemed to echo through the large room. Dominic ran a hand over his face, a deep, weary breath escaping him. "Roger," he said softly, the name heavy with the realization of betrayal. He looked up at Camilla, his eyes filled with a mixture of sorrow and resolve. "He was like a brother to me. We grew up together in the old neighborhoods, and I brought him into this firm to build a legitimate future. When we value integrity above power, Camilla said gently, meeting his gaze. We find our true purpose. You cannot protect those around you if you hide the truth from them. Roger's actions do not reflect on your character. They reflect only on his own. Dominic nodded slowly. He walked over to the armchair by the window, staring out into the dark night. He realized that Camilla was right. To build a secure future, one had to be willing to look at the truth, no matter how painful it might be. Thank you, Dr. Voss, Dominic said, turning back to her with a renewed sense of purpose. You have shown a kind of courage that money cannot buy. You have saved my life, and now you have saved my enterprise from a deeper betrayal. Dominic turned back to the desk and picked up the phone. He dialed a direct line to his security team. Vance, he said, his voice hard but under complete control. Bring your brother to the study. We have some matters to discuss regarding the logistics manifest. He hung up the phone and looked at Camilla, a respectful smile forming on his lips. We must build a legacy of health, education, and mutual respect, Dominic said, his words measured. Let us show the next generation that true strength lies in service to the community and in a commitment to the truth. The study was thick with the scent of rain and old paper, the grandfather clock ticking away the seconds in a slow, deliberate rhythm that seemed to mock the tension in the room. Dominic sat behind the mahogany desk, his hands resting on the manila envelope Camilla had found. Roger Vance stood near the bookshelf, his face pale, his eyes darting between Dominic and the document spread across the wood. Vance, Dominic's closest advisor and older brother to Roger, stood near the door, his expression one of profound disbelief. He had spent his entire adult life serving the Reyes family, working alongside his brother to build a legitimate future out of a past filled with uncertainty and danger. To see that very future undermined from within was a betrayal that cut deeper than any knife wound. Explain this, Roger. Dominic's voice was barely more than a whisper, yet it cut through the silence of the room with the force of a physical blow. He did not yell, nor did he reach for the weapon he kept in his desk drawer. He simply pointed to the memo detailing the unauthorized shipments of experimental chemicals to the Salazar family's shell company. Roger swallowed hard, his hands trembling as he shoved them into his pockets. He looked at the floor, unable to meet the eyes of the man who had given him a second chance at life, when they were just young men trying to survive on the streets. I needed the money, Dominic, Roger said, his voice cracking under the weight of his own guilt. My investments in the new terminal went bad, and the Salazars, they knew about it. They offered to clear my debts if I just looked the other way when their shipments came through. They promised no one would get hurt. They said it was just business. Vance took a step toward his brother, his face red with a mixture of anger and sorrow. Business? You call poisoning the head of this family and putting the entire operation at risk just business? We spent years distancing ourselves from that kind of cruelty, Roger. We swore an oath to build something we could be proud of. Dominic raised a hand, stopping the argument before it could escalate. He stood up slowly, walking over to the window that looked out over the wet courtyard. The rain continued to fall, washing the cobblestones clean, just as he had spent years trying to wash the violence out of his family's legacy. In our world, Roger, we learn very quickly that trust is the most difficult thing to earn and the easiest thing to lose, Dominic said, turning back to face the younger man. You traded your integrity and the lives of the people you worked with for a temporary reprieve from a financial mistake. But true strength is not about avoiding problems. It is about facing the consequences of our choices and maintaining our honor when the test comes. Roger hung his head, tears welling up in his eyes as the realization of what he had thrown away washed over him. He had compromised his soul for nothing, and the very foundation of the life he knew was now crumbling beneath his feet. I don't expect you to forgive me, Dominic, Roger whispered. I was a fool. I thought I could outsmart them, but I just became their instrument. Dominic walked over to the desk, picked up the file, and handed it to Vance. His expression was solemn, devoid of malice, but firm in his resolution. We do not resolve this with street justice, Vance, Dominic said, looking at his longtime advisor. We hand these files over to the federal authorities. The law must take its course, and Roger will have to answer for his actions in a court of law. It is the only way to prove that our business is truly legitimate and that we are no longer part of the old world. Vance nodded slowly, though his hands shook as he took the envelope from Dominic. Thank you, Mr. Reyes. You are fair, even when it hurts the most. Family and loyalty are tested not when things are easy, but when they are hard, Dominic said, placing a hand on Vance's shoulder. We must stand by the principles we built. Let us make sure that Roger understands that the greatest loss is not the money or the position, but the good name and the respect of the people who trusted him. As Vance escorted his brother from the study to face the authorities, Dominic returned to his desk. He sat in the dark, his thoughts drifting to the dining room, and the moment the plate had shattered. The world was full of people who sought to tear down what others had built, but as long as there were those who were willing to speak the truth, the core of their enterprise remained intact. The news of Roger's arrest sent shockwaves through the syndicate's network in the city. The Salazar family, having realized that their plot had been uncovered and their insider compromised, decided to abandon their corporate facade and resort to the brute force that had characterized their early years in the underground. At the city's central hospital, where Dr. Camilla Voss headed the emergency and research division, the atmosphere was one of quiet vigilance. Dominic had placed an elite security detail around the facility, knowing that the Salazars might see Camila as the primary obstacle to their plans. The time was past midnight. The rain had finally stopped, leaving the streets slick and illuminated only by the faint yellow glow of the streetlights. Dominic arrived at the hospital's private entrance, flanked by his two most trusted security officers. He had come to check on the security arrangements and to ensure that Camilla and her mother were safe. He found Camilla in her office, reviewing the toxicological reports on her tablet. She looked tired, but there was a sharp focus in her eyes that reminded him of the moment she had knocked the cake from his hand. "You shouldn't be here, Mr. Reyes," Camilla said as she looked up, her expression a mix of surprise and concern. "The Salazars are desperate. If they know you are here, they might see this as an opportunity to strike at the center of your operations." "The center of my operations is where the truth is being protected, Doctor," Dominic said, taking a seat across from her desk. "And right now, that is here with you. We have handed the evidence regarding Roger's involvement to the authorities. The Salazar family is feeling the pressure, and they may try to make a move to retrieve their compromised assets from the hospital." As if on cue, the communication radio on the security guard's belt crackled to life, the voice of the head of the security team sounding tense. "Mr. Reyes, we have multiple vehicles approaching the main entrance. They are not authorized, and they are moving fast. We have deployed the perimeter defense." Dominic stood up immediately, his posture shifting from that of a corporate leader to that of a man who understood how to navigate the turbulent waters of a confrontation. He turned to Camilla, his eyes calm and reassuring. "Stay here, Camilla," Dominic said, his voice low and steady. "Vance will secure the floor. We will not let them disrupt the work you do or the lives you save." "I am not going to hide while there are people who need medical attention," Camilla said, standing up with a medical kit in her hands. "If they breach the security, there will be injuries. My place is in the triage area, where I can do the most good." Dominic looked at her with a deep sense of respect. She possessed a kind of bravery that was not based on aggression, but on an absolute dedication to preserving human life. He nodded slowly, signaling his guards to form a defensive line around the doctor's station in the central hallway. The sound of shattering glass echoed from the lower levels of the wing. Dominic moved to the top of the stairwell, his presence commanding, and his eyes assessing the situation. A group of men, armed and moving with the quick, uncoordinated movements of street fighters, were making their way up the stairs. Instead of drawing a weapon, Dominic walked down the first few steps, his voice echoing through the corridor with a quiet, undeniable authority that made the advancing men hesitate. "Stop where you are," Dominic said, his voice carrying the weight of a man who had led the city for decades. "You are running into a trap that you do not understand. Roger has given the authorities everything. If you fire a single shot in this facility, you will bring the full force of the law down upon your operation." The leader of the group, A man with a scar across his left eye sneered as he raised his weapon. "We are not here to talk, Reyes. We are here to finish what we started." Vance and his team stepped forward, their defensive positions clear and their focus absolute. They had the advantage of preparation and the discipline that Dominic had instilled in them over the past 3 years of legitimate enterprise. "When we rely on each other's strengths, we become invincible against hardship," Dominic said, looking directly at the men. "Justice is not found in vengeance. True power lies in upholding the law and protecting the lives of innocent people. You can choose to leave now and return to your families, or you can spend the rest of your lives behind bars." The men looked at each other, the weight of Dominic's calm authority and the sight of the well-trained security team causing them to reconsider their options. The leader lowered his weapon, realizing that the cost of the confrontation was far higher than any reward the Salazar family could offer. "We're leaving," the leader said, gesturing to his men to retreat down the stairs. "But this isn't over." Dominic watched them leave, his expression unchanged. He turned back to the triage area, where Camilla was already attending to a nurse who had been cut by the shattered glass. He walked over to them, offering his handkerchief to help clean the wound. "You did well, Dr. Voss," Dominic said, his voice warm and supportive. "You showed that when people stand together, no amount of force can break their spirit." "We are only as strong as the community that supports us," Camilla replied, her hands steady as she applied the bandage. "Thank you for standing with us, Dominic. The truth will always outlast the darkness." The morning sun broke through the heavy gray clouds over Boston, casting long, sharp shadows across the polished marble floors of the Reyes Enterprises headquarters. The building, a towering structure of glass and steel in the heart of the financial district, stood as a monument to Dominic Reyes's evolution. It was a far cry from the dimly lit back rooms and smoky dockyard warehouses where his father had once conducted the family's business. This was the new world, a world of transparency, corporate strategy, and undeniable legitimacy. Dominic stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows of his top-floor boardroom, looking out over the waking city. His tailored charcoal suit was immaculate, his posture unyielding. Despite the physical and emotional exhaustion of the past 48 hours, the poisoned cake, the betrayal of Roger Vance, and the attempted siege at the hospital, his mind was as clear and cold as a winter stream. Vance stood by the massive oak conference table, organizing a series of thick black leather folders. The air in the room was completely silent, save for the faint, steady hum of the climate control system. There were no armed guards in the corners of the room, no muscle waiting in the wings. In this new era, the most dangerous weapons were not made of metal and gunpowder. They were made of ink, federal statutes, and irrefutable financial data. "The federal marshals have secured the perimeter of the Salazar family's primary distribution centers," Vance said, his voice steady, though the dark circles under his eyes betrayed his exhaustion. "The wire transfer records from Roger's offshore accounts have been verified and cross-referenced with the Salazar shell companies. We have everything, Mr. Reyes. The paper trail is completely airtight." Dominic turned away from the window, his expression solemn. He walked toward the table and rested his hands on the smooth oak surface. "Good," Dominic replied quietly. "Hector Salazar operates under the assumption that the only way to resolve a conflict is through blood and intimidation. He believes that because I stepped away from the streets, I have grown weak. Today, we will teach him that true power does not require a single shot to be fired." At exactly 9 o'clock, the heavy glass doors of the boardroom swung open. Hector Salazar walked in, flanked by two massive men whose ill-fitting suits did little to hide the bulk of the weapons holstered beneath their jackets. Hector was a man of the old guard, proud, ruthless, and entirely unwilling to adapt to the changing tides of the city. His face was weathered, his eyes hard and calculating as he scanned the empty room, clearly expecting an ambush. Following closely behind Hector was Arthur, Elena's father. Arthur looked entirely out of place, his face pale and slick with a cold sweat. He had financed the Salazar's move against Dominic, hoping to seize control of the Reyes logistics empire through a tragic accident at the engagement dinner. Now, standing in the bright, unforgiving light of the corporate boardroom, Arthur realized he had gravely miscalculated the man he was trying to destroy. Dominic did not offer his hand. He simply gestured to the empty leather chairs across the table. "Sit down, Hector." "Arthur," Dominic said, his voice carrying an effortless authority that commanded the room without rising above a conversational volume. Hector sneered, remaining standing as a show of defiance. "You called a sit-down in a glass box, Reyes? What is this? You think because you wear a nice suit and own a skyscraper that you're untouchable?" "My men are on the streets. My shipments are moving. You made a mistake pulling your guards back last night." Dominic looked at Hector with a calm, almost pitying expression. He reached out and opened the first black leather folder, turning it around so that it faced the rival boss. "Sit down, Hector," Dominic repeated, the absolute certainty in his tone leaving no room for argument. Slowly, reluctantly, Hector lowered himself into the chair. Arthur practically collapsed into the seat beside him, his eyes fixed on the folders. "You speak of your men on the streets and your shipments moving," Dominic began, pacing slowly behind his side of the table. "But you are playing a game that ended yesterday. You thought you could remove me at my own engagement dinner. You thought you could corrupt my people and threaten a hospital full of innocent civilians. You operated on the assumption that I would retaliate with violence, igniting a war that would distract the authorities while you seized my assets." Dominic paused, letting the silence hang heavy in the air. He looked directly into Arthur's eyes, watching the older man flinch. "But I do not fight wars in the streets anymore," Dominic continued, his voice ringing with absolute clarity. "War destroys communities. It destroys families. Wisdom is recognizing that the best way to defeat an enemy is to dismantle their foundation entirely. While your men were trying to break glass at the hospital last night, my legal team was speaking with a federal judge." Dominic tapped the open folder. "Inside this file is a comprehensive ledger of every illegal transaction your shell companies have made over the last 3 years. It includes the purchase order for the synthetic neurotoxin used to poison my cake, signed by your lieutenant. It includes the bribery of Roger Vance." Hector's confident sneer faltered. He reached out and snatched the file, his eyes scanning the documents. As he read the banking codes, the dates, and the exact dollar amounts, the color slowly drained from his weathered face. "You're bluffing," Hector growled, though his voice lacked its previous venom. "These are just papers. I have lawyers who can bury this in court for a decade." "You could," Dominic agreed calmly, "if these files were only in my possession. But as we speak, copies of these ledgers, along with a sworn toxicological report from Dr. Camila Voss and a full confession from Roger Vance, are sitting on the desks of the district attorney, the FBI Organized Crime Division, and the IRS." Arthur let out a ragged gasp, burying his face in his hands. "My God," he whispered. "We're ruined. Dominic, please, the family. Elena had no part in the financial side, I swear to you." Dominic turned his gaze to Arthur. He felt a brief pang of sorrow for Elena, a woman caught in the middle of her father's greed, but he knew that boundaries had to be maintained. "Your daughter will not be implicated in the criminal charges, Arthur," Dominic said, his tone firm but devoid of malice. "But our engagement is officially broken. I cannot build a future with a family that values ambition over human life. Integrity is not a garment you can put on and take off when it suits you. It is the very core of who we are. You betrayed that integrity, and now you must face the consequences." Hector stood up abruptly, his chair scraping violently against the marble floor. His 2 bodyguards tensed, their hands hovering over their jackets. Vance immediately stepped forward, his eyes locked on the threats, but Dominic raised a hand, keeping his advisor in place. "If you reach for those weapons," Dominic said to the guards, his voice turning to ice, "you will not be arrested for financial fraud. You will be arrested for attempted murder in a building equipped with 40 security cameras feeding directly to a private server. Think very carefully about what your lives are worth." The guards hesitated, looking at Hector for guidance. Hector stared at Dominic, his chest heaving with a mixture of rage and profound defeat. The realization crashed over him. He had brought a knife to a chess match, and he had been checkmated before he even understood the rules. "What do you want, Reyes?" Hector spat, his pride shattered. "If the feds have the files, I'm already dead." "The federal authorities have the files, but they have not yet acted on the warrants," Dominic replied, leaning forward, resting his hands flat on the table. This was the moment of the true reckoning. "I have arranged a window of opportunity. You have exactly 24 hours to sign over all of your legitimate waterfront holdings, your warehouses, and your transit contracts to the Reyes Corporate Trust. In exchange, my legal team will present the evidence to the authorities as a closed investigation regarding your subordinates, allowing you and Arthur to quietly leave the country." Hector stared in absolute disbelief. "You're letting us walk away? After we tried to kill you? Why?" Dominic straightened his posture, looking at the men who represented everything he had spent his life trying to escape. "Because justice is not found in vengeance," Dominic stated, explicitly laying out the philosophy that guided his life. "If I have you killed, or if I let a war tear through the docks, innocent people will suffer. Employees will lose their jobs, families will be caught in the crossfire, and I will become the very monster you tried to defeat. True power lies in upholding the law and protecting the lives of innocent people. By taking your assets and forcing your exile, I secure the safety of the city without shedding a single drop of blood." Dominic walked around the table, standing mere feet from Hector. He did not show fear, he only showed absolute, unwavering conviction. "You thought power was about instilling fear, Hector," Dominic said quietly. "But fear is fragile. The moment someone is no longer afraid of you, your empire collapses. Respect, wisdom, and a commitment to human dignity. Those are the foundations of an empire that lasts. Sign the papers, leave Boston, and never return." Hector looked down at the contract Vance slid across the table. His hands shook with suppressed fury, but the cold reality of the federal prison system loomed over him. Without a word, he pulled a gold pen from his pocket and signed his name on the dotted line. Arthur followed, sobbing quietly as he signed away his family's legacy. When the ink was dry, Hector threw the pen onto the table. He turned and walked out of the boardroom, his guards trailing behind him like beaten dogs. Arthur paused at the door, looking back at Dominic with tear-filled eyes. "I am sorry, Dominic," Arthur whispered. "So am I, Arthur," Dominic replied softly. "Safe travels." When the heavy glass doors clicked shut, the boardroom returned to its perfect, serene silence. Vance let out a long breath, stepping forward to gather the signed contracts. "It's done, Mr. Reyes," Vance said, a profound sense of relief in his voice. "The Salazar threat is neutralized, and we have absorbed their infrastructure. We did it exactly the way you said we would." Dominic looked out the window once more. The clouds were beginning to part, revealing patches of bright blue sky over the city. The storm had passed. He had faced the darkest parts of his past and had defeated them by choosing a different path. "We did, Vance," Dominic said, a rare, genuine smile touching his features. "We proved that a sharp mind is sharper than any blade. Now, let us take these new assets and build something that actually matters. Let us build a legacy of health, education, and mutual respect." Dominic turned and walked out of the boardroom, leaving the shadows of the old world behind him forever, ready to step into the light of the future he had fought so hard to secure. The morning light poured through the towering glass facade of the newly renovated Reyes Logistics and Medical Center, casting a warm, golden glow across the polished terrazzo floors. 6 weeks had passed since the reckoning in the boardroom. In that short time, the skyline of Boston had not changed, but the spirit of its economic and social life had shifted in a profound and permanent way. Dominic Reyes stood near the center of the grand atrium, watching the steady flow of employees, doctors, and logistics managers move through the complex. The transformation of his enterprise from a syndicate into a unified corporate and medical network was complete. The old warehouses of District 4, once the source of suspicion and silent threats, had been converted into distribution hubs for medical supplies and advanced diagnostic equipment, serving community clinics across the eastern seaboard. Dominic wore a well-tailored navy suit, his posture relaxed but commanding. He no longer carried the heavy defensive weight of a man who constantly had to watch his back. Instead, he carried the quiet, steady confidence of a leader who had found a higher purpose. The first shipment of diagnostic machines is ready for dispatch to the northern clinics, Mr. Reyes, Vance said, stepping up beside him with a tablet in hand. Vance's demeanor had lightened. The shadow of his brother's betrayal had been heavy, but the decisive, clean handling of the crisis had allowed the firm to move forward with a renewed sense of purpose. Ensure that the delivery is handled with the utmost care, Dominic replied, his voice calm and resonant. These machines represent more than just technology. They represent accessibility, trust, and the fundamental right of every person to receive proper care. We do not need to shout to be heard. Our work will speak for itself. Indeed, sir, Vance said, nodding with deep respect. Dr. Voss is holding her first orientation session for the new research staff in the West Wing. She requested your presence, if your schedule allows. It does, Dominic said, checking his watch. Let us go up. The corporate medical division was bright and spacious, designed to minimize the intimidating atmosphere usually associated with large institutions. Dr. Camilla Voss stood at the head of the conference table, surrounded by young doctors, researchers, and community health organizers. Her white coat was crisp, her expression bright and focused. As Dominic entered the room, the conversations quieted, but there was no tension in the air. The staff looked at the former syndicate boss not with fear, but with respect for the man who had funded their work and protected their independence. Dr. Voss? Dominic said, greeting her with a respectful nod. Mr. Reyes, thank you for joining us, Camilla smiled, stepping forward. She turned to her team, gesturing toward the blueprints of the new community outreach program displayed on the wall. We were just discussing the core values that will guide our work here. This clinic is not just a place for treatment, it is a promise to the community. Camilla looked at Dominic, her eyes reflecting a shared sense of conviction, and then addressed the room with a clear, steady voice that carried throughout the bright space. We must build a legacy of health, education, and mutual respect, Camilla said, her words ringing with the humanistic values she had championed from the very beginning. Let us show the next generation that true strength lies in service. When we value the dignity of every patient, we do not simply cure illnesses, we build a resilient society where people can trust in the goodness of others. Dominic stepped beside her, his presence adding weight to her message. He looked at the young doctors and researchers, his gaze sweeping the room with quiet intensity. Dr. Voss is right, Dominic added, his deep voice echoing the philosophy that had transformed his empire. For too long, power was measured by what we could control or destroy. But I have learned that the greatest victory is not over our enemies, but over our own weaknesses. True wisdom is knowing how to use our resources to lift others up. When we invest in education and health, we create an unbreakable foundation that no adversity can shatter. The room broke into a murmur of agreement, followed by a light, hopeful round of applause. Camilla handed Dominic a small ceremonial key that would unlock the main doors of the community clinic on the ground floor. The doors are yours to open, Mr. Reyes, Camilla said softly. No, doctor, Dominic replied, gently placing his hand over hers on the key. We will open them together. This is a journey we have taken as partners in truth. Together, they walked down to the main entrance, followed by the staff and the community leaders who had gathered to witness the new beginning. As the glass doors swung open, the morning sun flooded into the lobby, illuminating the bright, clean space where countless lives would be healed. Later that afternoon, Dominic sat in his new office, which was free of the dark wood and heavy shadows that had defined the estate's study. The windows were wide, revealing the bustling city below. He looked at the framed photograph of his family's old estate, a reminder of where he had come from, and then looked at the new charter of Reyes Enterprises on his desk. The transition was complete. He had replaced the old code of silence and violence with a new code of transparency, loyalty, and service. He had built something that would outlast the name of any boss. The evening sun was beginning to dip below the Boston harbor, painting the sky in deep shades of gold and purple. The city was quiet, recovering from the rapid pace of the week's transitions, and the Reyes building stood tall and steady against the horizon. Dominic Reyes and Dr. Camilla Voss stood on the terrace of the corporate penthouse, looking out over the city they had both worked to protect. The air was cool, carrying the fresh scent of the ocean breeze, free of the damp, heavy smell of the old docks. Dominic held a small, antique pocket watch in his hand, the same one his father had given him when he first took charge of the logistics business. He turned it over, feeling the scratches on the casing, and then snapped it closed, a gesture that signaled the final closing of a long chapter in his life. "The transition is complete, Dominic," Camilla said, her voice soft as she leaned against the railing of the terrace. She wore a simple, elegant dark dress, her hair catching the evening wind. "The clinics are fully funded, the research team is moving forward, and the logistics network is functioning entirely on legal, transparent contracts." Dominic turned his dark, intense eyes toward her, a deep expression of gratitude and warmth on his face. "It would not have been possible without you, Camilla," Dominic said, his deep voice rich with emotion. "You saw the danger when I was blinded by the traditions of the past. You taught me that true power is not about the control of territory, but about the preservation of human dignity." Camilla looked out over the city, the lights beginning to twinkle in the gathering twilight. "You had the courage to listen, Dominic," she replied, meeting his gaze with a steady, sincere look. "Many men in your position would have let their pride dictate their actions. But you chose to use your wisdom to seek the truth and to protect the innocent. That requires a great deal of strength." Dominic nodded slowly. He reached into his coat pocket and withdrew a small, ornate key, the key to the Lucia ward, the new pediatric research and care facility they had established in honor of Camilla's late grandmother, a nurse who had dedicated her life to the children of the city. He handed the key to Camilla, his fingers closing gently over hers for a brief, meaningful moment. "This ward is named after your family's legacy of service," Dominic said. "It stands as a testament to the fact that when we work together, we can turn the darkest histories into a source of hope and healing for the future." Camilla looked down at the key, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "It is a beautiful name," Camilla said softly. "Lucia means light, and that is exactly what we have brought to this city. A light that will continue to shine for the generations that follow us." Dominic stepped closer to her, the distance between them dissolving as they shared the silence of the evening. They had faced betrayal, violence, and the weight of old traditions, but they had emerged stronger, united by a common belief in the value of every human life. "In our world," Dominic said, his voice quiet and resonant, "we often forget that the simplest lessons are the most important ones. Loyalty is not a debt we owe to a family or a name. It is a choice of character. Respect is not something we demand through fear. It is something we earn through truth and kindness." "And love," Camilla added, looking up at him with a gentle, radiant smile. "It is the courage to stand by someone when the night is at its darkest, knowing that the morning will bring a clearer, better path." Dominic nodded, his dark eyes softening as he smiled down at her. He placed his arm around her shoulders, turning together to look out over the city. Below them, the streets were bright and safe, the traffic moving in a steady, peaceful rhythm. The story of the syndicate, the poisons, and the old fears was over. The new chapter of the Reyes family was written not in the ledgers of violence, but in the books of life, health, and community service. They had built an empire not of stone and lead, but of human connection, trust, and mutual respect. As the first stars began to appear in the clear evening sky, Dominic and Camilla stood together, ready to face the future with a clear mind, an open heart, and an unwavering commitment to the values that truly matter.
For decades, the underworld has sold us a dangerous lie. We are told that a true boss rules with an iron fist, that respect must be forged in fear, and that every slight must be answered with violence. But after years of writing about the men who command these empires, I can tell you that the story of Dominic Reyes shatters that illusion completely. The tale we just witnessed is not about the crude mechanics of crime. It is a masterclass in the true architecture of power, resilience, and human dignity. At its core, the moral of this story revolves around one profound truth: real power whispers, while weakness shouts. When faced with a lethal betrayal at his own engagement dinner, Dominic did not resort to the blind, bloody vengeance of the old world. A lesser man, a weaker boss, would have torn the room apart. Dominic, however, demonstrated that the sharpest weapon a leader possesses is a calm, calculating mind. He teaches us that true strength lies in absolute restraint. In business and in life, the ability to measure the cost of your actions before you take a single step is what separates fleeting tyrants from enduring kings. He dismantled the Salazar family not with bullets, but with undeniable evidence, financial leverage, and strategic foresight. Equally powerful is the lesson embodied by Dr. Camilla Voss. In a room full of elite, silent guests who valued social decorum and wealth over human life, it was the maid's daughter who possessed the courage to scream the truth. Camilla teaches us the irreplaceable value of observation and the raw bravery required to disrupt the status quo. Her actions remind us that integrity is not bound by class, title, or wealth. If we fail to speak up against deceit, or if we ignore the subtle signs of danger simply because it is easier to look away, our power and our wealth mean absolutely nothing. Furthermore, this story fundamentally redefines the concept of loyalty. Through the tragic fall of Roger Vance and the greed of Elena's father, we see men who traded their honor for temporary relief and blind ambition. They learned too late that trust is the most difficult currency to earn and the easiest to lose. Dominic teaches us that true loyalty cannot be bought. It is a mutual respect for character. By surrounding himself with those who value truth over comfort, he proves that an empire is only as strong as the integrity of the people within it. Ultimately, the greatest victory in this narrative is not the defeat of a rival cartel, but the triumph over a dark legacy. Dominic and Camilla show us that it is never too late to rewrite your history. By transforming a violent syndicate into a foundation for healing and community service, the ultimate lesson is clear. A kingdom built on fear will eventually collapse, but a legacy built on respect, service, and human dignity will stand forever. That is the true code of a boss. This story exists within the realm of fiction, where imagination shapes reality. Any similarities to real-life individuals, organizations, or events are entirely coincidental. The author does not endorse or represent any real entity through the content of this work.